Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
From atheist to eventually Catholic, Pat Flynn. Welcome everyone to Polycarp's Paradigm. My name is Eric Robinson. I'm joined with my friend Pat Flynn today. Welcome, Pat.
Eric, it is a pleasure to be on Polycarp's Paradigm. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Well, if you don't mind, just introduce yourself to our audience and we can get going with your story.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I have a somewhat eclectic background. Mostly I write books on everything from fitness to philosophy of religion. My website is chroniclesofstrength.com, and people might be wondering how, what does this guy actually do? It's just to make a very long and mostly boring story short. My sort of academic background would be in economics and then later philosophy. But when I was in college, I paid the bills by personal training people, and I started a fitness blog, and I started putting stuff on YouTube, and eventually that became a thing, and it led to me writing books and doing online business and podcasts and all sorts of a whole bunch of really odd but at least interesting to me stuff, and that's what I've been doing ever since. Yep. Mm-hmm.
That is awesome. And for those of you who haven't checked out some previous episodes, I actually had the privilege of going on Pat's podcast called The Pat Flynn Show, and we recorded some episodes and I aired them on Polycarp's Paradigm, but this is my first time to get to be on the other side of the table and interview Pat, so I'm so excited. And a few weeks ago, I interviewed my friend Brian, who actually went from being Christian to agnostic. And so I thought, hey, I want to kind of reverse the situation now and interview someone who went from being atheist to Catholic. And so let's begin there. So how did you grow up? What was that like? What was your first inclinations towards atheism? How did you become an atheist? Because I don't think most people are born atheists. So how did that happen?
Yeah, at least they're not born atheists in the sense that I would use it, in that I was really committed to the philosophical project of naturalism, which I think is the most robust form of atheism. Certainly people aren't born that type of atheist any more than my dog is born an atheist, right? But in a sense, I think I might be similar to your friend, is that I was baptized Catholic, and I was raised in a very nominally religious family. So I never received any type of catechesis or significant religious education or any kind. We would go to church occasionally. We were your typical Creasters, Christmas and Easter, but mostly really whenever the grandparents were in town, we would go to church. But it wasn't something that was ever really in my family. We never talked about religion, never really talked about God. It was just kind of a cultural, thing. Hey, we're Catholic, I guess, but we didn't really live it. So yeah, I think that was part of the issue, is that I just never really received a good formation when I was younger. So that way, when I started becoming more curious, and as I got older, and I specifically remember the first time I really started to doubt the entire religious worldview, and specifically the Christian worldview. It was in the 6th grade, in the same classroom. This will give people an indication of how old I am, or young, depending where you're coming from.
Right.
in the same classroom that I was in when 9/11 happened. And these are two big events in my life. One was seeing the towers fall, and the other was having everything about my fundamental worldview challenged when my teacher first began giving us the general sketch of the origins of the universe and the Big Bang Theory. And I remember just this feeling this great empty space between my stomach and my neck, of feeling wow, this is not at all what I was taught when I was a kid. I thought that God made everything in just a couple of days. And there's no mention here of Adam or Eve or of any insidious snake. Now, of course, I didn't ever pursue the theologically nuanced adult version of Catholic theology. I just had this sort of very rudimentary babyish understanding, but that was...
Oh, you were in 6th grade, Pat.
I was in the 6th grade, right? But at the same time, to be fair, in the 6th grade, some people were, 6th graders aren't stupid. Some of them are doing pretty high level stuff, including mathematics. So why aren't we giving them more significant theology?
That's true.
So I don't even want to concede. I think that is a failure of a lot of religious people, is that kids, especially since I've started working with like kids and teaching Sunday school, like last year I taught fourth graders, and those kids are smart. They want to engage the deep questions. So I think, there's a huge failure there on that point. Like maybe we shouldn't expect them to understand and articulate everything, but I think people should be more challenged theologically than they are, especially by the time they're in middle school. But I wasn't. And so these were like the initial seeds of doubt. It wasn't like at that moment I'm an atheist. No, it was just kind of a gradual undermining and a sort of feeling like I'd been lied to in a way. So it caused in me a spirit of skepticism, you might say. And my other passions at the time, and they're still great passions of mine today, would be writing and music. So there were other influences pressing in on me, and this is now over the course, I would say, a couple of years, kind of going into high school, of certain musicians and writers that really influenced me. Musicians mostly from a lifestyle standpoint, of people who I really liked. I'm a guitarist. I love heavy metal, who just... They didn't seem to think religion was important, right?
Right.
And these are the guys that I looked up to. Now, it's kind of funny because later what I learned that a lot of the people I looked up to are religious. So people might be surprised to hear that like Alice Cooper is a devout Christian and he's like Dave Mustaine from Megadeth's Godfather. And apparently the lead singer of Slayer is Catholic, which boggles my mind. But
wow.
I guess that's a thing. Anyway, I didn't realize that at the time. So I'm just like, look, these guys are like out there rocking, they're rolling, they're pretty bad dudes. I kind of want to be like them, and they don't seem to think religion is important. So that was an influence. But then writing specifically, I was really into a lot of different writers that I think were, if not atheistic, they were religiously antagonistic. Mark Twain was a big influence on me. I'm not sure what his religious position was, at the end of his days. He always seemed very religiously curious. And it's interesting to note that he considered his greatest work to be his book on Saint Joan of Arc. He had a very profound like reverence for her. So I think God actually was trying to pull him to the Catholic Church in an interesting way.
I don't know if you know this about Mark Twain, Pat, but my mom grew up Christian Science, and she wasn't allowed to read Mark Twain.
He killed Christian Science.
Yeah, exactly. I know.
He killed it. And I love that. I loved his essays on Christian Science. That's so funny you bring that up, because he actually had, I'm sorry, Eric, I totally cut you off. You should continue.
No, this is great. This is great.
But right, so like he has these essays on Christian Science where he just rails into it, he parodies it, he just ridicules it, and it's hilarious.
Wow.
And so I'm reading this stuff, and I'm like, yeah, this whole religious stuff is like so ridiculous, right? And I would recommend that anybody does read Twain's essays on Christian Science. They are really funny. And Christian Science is bizarre, don't get me wrong, right? But that doesn't mean religion as a whole is bizarre.
Yeah.
But he also has essays like What is Man, which is very deterministic. And when you're young, you don't have responses to these things, right? You don't know, like they influence you. And so, again, I don't know what his final position was, but he really, I guess, continued to push me along. And then from Twain, I discovered another writer named H.L. Mencken, who was a vicious old atheist. I mean, like he was like the Christopher Hitchens of the old days. And he's still a great writer. I think he's hilarious. I think he's worth reading. And he's worth reading because you'll see that a lot of the sort of atheistic slogans and objections that get thrown out today aren't new. Like they go way back. Like you can they're just rehashed and reused. So he throws out like the same objections of, well, I only believe in one less God than you, and these types of things. So you realize that they just kind of pass these old chestnuts along. But again, deeply influential to me as a writer. And he, interestingly enough, wrote the first English work of Friedrich Nietzsche, the great old atheist philosopher. So he kind of passed me off to that philosophical tradition. So that's how I think I got introduced to atheism proper, atheism in like the strong form of really taking a worldview that is, something reductionist, physicalist, materialist, and really trying to drive that worldview through. So that really, I always think I was interested in the big questions, the philosophical questions, but it was through that path that I think I was first formally introduced to philosophy. So I just really dove in with so many of these atheistic and existentialist thinkers, Nietzsche, Sartre, and then later people like Russell and Mackey, like good atheistic thinkers, at least in some senses, anyways. And this would have been by later high school, going into college. So they left a huge impression on me. And at that point, I had assumed, pretty much the general naturalist philosophy. Was not only just like, and here we have to kind of define, because people use atheism ambiguously, right? Like some people might use it in a very weak sense of saying like, I don't really know if God exists or doesn't exist. And I think we could probably say that's more agnostic.
Yeah.
Whereas atheism in the strong sense, the atheism that I was interested in really is trying to establish a worldview. And in that worldview, there just is no room for God or anything like God or anything immaterial or spirits or souls or ghosts or anything like that. So it's much more, and I was interested because it wasn't, for me, it was never just about, just remaining in a state of ignorance. I don't think that that's virtuous at all.
Right.
I think agnosticism is a position that you might be in, but I don't think it's a position you should ever stay in. You should always be seeking to find answers. So I was always interested in like, what is the truth of things? And that always seemed like a good thing. And so I wanted answers ultimately. And part of the reason I rejected the religious worldview starting out is I didn't think it gave those answers.
Yeah.
And then part of why I eventually came back is because I realized it's the only thing that can give those answers.
Yeah, and like this atheistic paradigm was holistic. It explained kind of everything, at least at first. It makes sense. Like, of the world just came this way, and this is how it is. And did it feel like kind of a complete package at first? Or
there's a certain appeal to it in the sense that it's very simple. Right. Yeah. But the problem that I eventually realized is simple is good, but simplistic is bad. Yeah. And when it comes to looking for explanations, we can't just look for simplicity. I mean, that's good. That's one thing we should look for. Simple explanation should be generally preferred. Mm-hmm. But we also have to look for things like explanatory power, explanatory scope, degree of ad hocness, right? Logical possibility, all these different criteria, which should give weight to where we draw what we believe is the best explanation. So yeah, there's this initial simplicity that I think is very attractive. But as you go deeper into the materialist and naturalistic worldview, the reductionist worldview, I think if you're consistent with it, it becomes incoherent. And I think the only way you can make it coherent is if you're to some degree inconsistent with it.
So what's like one piece of, or a couple pieces of incoherence that you now realize in that worldview that's like, that doesn't make sense?
Yeah, well, one is just the Mac Daddy question of all, of how come anything, right? Like, why do any contingent facts or states of affairs or things exist rather than nothing at all? And it seems like the naturalists cannot answer this question. And in fact, most naturalistic philosophers usually just try to resort to some type of brute fact hypothesis. Well, it's just, we get to some fundamental thing, whether it's the laws of physics or some fundamental simples, whatever they are, and they just exist inexplicably. And not only does this seem deeply unsatisfying to me and incorrect, but it also seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, that there is a sufficient explanation for any contingent fact. And I think the principle of sufficient reason is something that can't be coherently denied. I think we have a true dilemma here, in the sense that if we deny something like the principle of sufficient reason, at least in the form that contingent things have an explanation, we immediately enter a radical skepticism, right? If things can just happen with no efficient cause or no sufficient explanation, well, then like maybe my cognitive states can just happen with no sufficient explanation,
wow.
Right? Maybe I believe the things I do, not because I think I have good reason or cause to believe them, but because they just happen inexplicably. So then I shouldn't believe the things I do, which means I shouldn't believe that the principle of sufficient reason is false. Right?
Wow.
So so this is an example where I think the position really undermines itself. It's a self-defeating position. And naturalism would I think, in its strongest forms, in like the forms of like David Hume or J.L. Mackie, like the best atheistic philosophers, I think you do have to eventually deny the PSR, and I think that's ultimately incoherent. And that if you affirm the PSR, which you should, God starts showing up on that intellectual radar screen pretty quickly as the ultimate non-arbitrary explanation, as that necessarily existing foundation that's unlimited, qualitatively perfect, and explains why everything else exists that's contingent, and in his very nature is that eternal and necessarily existing foundation for everything. So we can satisfy the principle of sufficient reason with God, but we can't do it.
So when you were kind of at the pinnacle of your atheism, your worldview, and you were reading all these guys, what was the first like crack in the armor? Maybe it was that argument, or what did you read, or what were your thoughts or maybe it was a feeling that you got of, I don't know, hollowness or meaninglessness. I don't know what it was, but take us through that. Like, what was the starting point of you becoming more of a theist?
Yeah, there's three things. There's that one, how come anything, which I think is like Leibniz said that's the most exquisite and important question that anybody can ask. Why is there something rather than nothing? And Leibniz would argue that if you try to answer that question, roll up the sleeves and do the intellectual work, you will get to God. I think he's right. But two other big ones would be consciousness. I do not think that consciousness is reducible to purely physical processes alone. I think there's really good philosophical arguments and scientific evidence to the contrary. So that would seem to me to refute naturalism or physicalism. It wouldn't prove Christianity is true, but it would get you, I think, to a different worldview, which is important. And we can go into some of that if you want. But the other one you mentioned, like meaninglessness, is morality, right? We have this moral experience. Some things seem truly good and other things seem truly bad. Well, where do we ground that? How do we make sense of our moral language of something being truly good or truly bad, unless we have some conception, even if it's not totally explicit, of what Plato would call the good is? Like, what is this? C.S. Lewis had a good example. He said, it's hard to make sense of a crooked line without first understanding what a straight line is. Well, same thing with our moral language. We're making these moral comparisons. What is that objective reference point? What is that, transcendent standard that seems to be absolutely needed to be able to ground our moral experience? And here we kind of have a choice. And this is why I think many atheists, consistent ones, are nihilists. They realize that the universe just can't provide the proper ontological foundations to make sense of good and evil in the way we commonly experience it. But rather than going back and revising their worldview, they'll simply deny that our moral experience really is meaningful, significant, veridical, or objective. Most of them would just say it's some type of an illusion. And I think that that's clearly false. I think there's something really bad about rape, like objectively bad.
Right.
There's things that are objectively bad that go on in the world all the time. And there's no logical incoherence in denying it, but there's no way anybody can live consistently with that. There's always a performance contradiction. And even in searching out the truth, even in being a nihilist, you're admitting implicitly that you think there's something good about that, right?
Wow.
That's so true. Yeah, right. You think that it's good to follow truth, that there's some type of value there. Well, why? Why, right? So you can't really escape it on a performance level. And I would argue there's no good arguments against it. The only argument against it is assuming that atheism is true. Sometimes people throw out like evolution. Didn't we just evolve to have our moral beliefs? But evolution doesn't answer the question, because we believe that we evolved to have all kinds of faculties. The question is, are our faculties reliable? And if we believe that we evolved to see things and those things are really there, and to feel things and those things are really there, why arbitrarily deny that we also evolved to perceive a moral realm as well? And certainly if God is behind the scene, that's just the sort of thing that we would expect, right? So I don't think there's any good arguments against our moral experience. And I think that direct experience is something that should not be denied unless you can give a really good argument against it. And since the only reason you would deny it is because you're something like a naturalist, but the experience of morality itself is stronger than any arguments I can think of for naturalism. So I think you should reject naturalism and be a theist, because that provides the ground for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And going back to your second one, consciousness, like, I guess the naturalist, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the naturalist position would be, it's just chemicals firing in your brain, like, and you just perceive it to be something transcendent or something beyond the physical, but it's really just that. So how did you get from that, or whatever the correct way of explaining the naturalist position is?
Yeah, there's
the transcendent.
There's two paths I think are really helpful for seeing that while consciousness may be correlated with physical processes, right? Like our consciousness might be connected with and correlated with certain brain states, it's not identical to them. It's not the same thing. One of those things is just using, and sometimes this argument seems overly simple to people, but it seems like a really good one to me, is just a simple principle of identity, right? If A equals B, then I can never be directly aware of A without being directly aware of B, right? So if the heads of a coin is the same thing as the tails of the coin, then I can never be directly aware of the heads without being directly aware of the tails. But I am directly aware of the heads without being aware of the tails. So it's not the same thing. They might be connected, right? They might be part of the one and the same coin, but they aren't identical. The heads is different from the tails. Well, if you want to say that our thoughts, for example, or our ideas are just axons firing in the brain, well, I have direct awareness of my thoughts, but I have no awareness, even indirect, of any chemical interactions in my brain, of any axons firing. And vice versa, right? We can run all the neuroscientific experiments on somebody's brain. We can measure all the electrical impulses, look at all the circuitry, and we would never know that inhabiting that brain is a first-person reflective sense of self. We would never know that just by looking at the brain from a third-person perspective.
Yeah.
And the only reason we do know that is because we have that experience ourselves, and we believe other people when they tell us that they have similar experiences. So it just seems like A does not equal B, that our thoughts, our consciousness does not equal our brain states. Now, there seems to be a very important connection there, but not identity. So it's not reducible to. There's something else there that is not explained by just, say, the physical facts alone. The other problem, I think, is the problem, and of course, I'm just giving a general sketch here, right? You can develop these arguments in more detail, and there's, of course, objections that should be addressed. But I think I think when you really look at that type of argument, it can be quite persuasive. Other ones are from intentionality. Those are probably too technical to want to get into now, but another kind of quick one would be an argument sometimes called from the categorical gap, right? So if you assume that all physical reality at bottom is some type of particular, some physical particular. Maybe it's fundamental particles or something else. Doesn't really matter. But what you believe about this physical particular is that it's unconscious, unaware, it's undirected, it's disparate, it's not unified. It's all those things, right? This is a common naturalistic assumption. Well, now we have to imagine that through just enough time and chance, those physical particulars somehow cobbled together to form their complete and perfect qualitative opposite, not quantitative, but qualitative opposite. They flipped over into something that is aware, directed, conscious, and unified.
Wow.
And the analogy to try and drive how much of a problem this is, not just a problem of practical mathematical improbability, but I think strict logical impossibility, is that it doesn't matter how many white Lego blocks you have. You're never going to build a purple tower. There's a qualitative abyss that just cannot be coherently traversed unless you have the right qualitative categories on hand, right? So we need like a can of paint or something. Time and chance alone cannot give you that qualitative difference that we have between what naturalism assumes reality is at bottom and what we experience as consciousness. So something's missing, I would argue.
Wow. And so, yeah, because as Catholics, like, you can believe in the theory of evolution, but we also have to believe that God is active and that he's involved in the process, like that he's the one creating and shaping that. So I guess that would be kind of that bucket of paint,
Yes, and nobody here is, it could be the bucket of paint. There could be other factors at play. The point is that God offers the proper qualitative categories, because now we have mind at the foundation, right?
Yeah.
And we can unpack all of what that entails, in more depth later if we want. But it seems like, okay, it's still a mystery how all of this works, but now it no longer seems like an impossibility, which is important. And just one point about evolution is you're right? Catholics can boldly affirm evolution. We just can't affirm evolution plus naturalism. That's the thing we deny. And the science on that does not say it's naturalism. The science is completely indifferent to that question. And that's just a common confusion, or it's a philosophical layer or add-on that people just assume that is not justified by the science itself. I think that's an important point to emphasize.
Yeah, I think it's so important too to like understand the difference between and the necessity of philosophy versus just science. And like the science of philosophy is a science. Like it's important to not be just bound up into the, what can I test through a microscope? Well, that doesn't answer the question of like why things exist, or like what's the meaning of this, or all those things. It's like, well, we still have questions like that are beyond the scope of like what we can test in a laboratory.
That's right. And this sort of assumption of what you're hinting at, scientism, right? That if we can't verify something through the empirical process, right? Then it's meaningless or it doesn't exist is clearly false, right? Because science runs off of a set of philosophical assumptions that itself could never prove. For example, science assumes logic. Science assumes mathematics. Science assumes that we have consciousness. Science even assumes, I would argue, morality, right? That it's wrong to lie about certain test results, right? And to perform your tests and report, honorably, and to not try and deceive people. So there's all these different assumptions, philosophical assumptions that science depends on. So the right view of science is that it's very good and powerful at searching out certain aspects of reality, but it's just limited in what it looks for, and that's okay. In the same sense that a metal detector is very good at finding metal, but that doesn't mean that plastic doesn't exist. We just find plastic through other means. Well, we can find, we can think about ontology or God's existence through philosophy, and same thing with morality. We have logic, we have mathematics. So, epistemology, like trying to understand how we come to truth, there's many different ways that we come to truth, and they can all be very valuable. And it would be, I think, not just often arbitrary, but very detrimental to want to confine yourself to just any one particular area, and especially science. It's certainly self-defeating. This is the common critique of scientism, is if you want to say that you should only believe what the scientists tell us, well, science doesn't tell you that you should only believe what the scientists tell us. That's a philosophical statement, right? So it doesn't even meet its own standard.
That's amazing. So, oh my goodness. So so you were atheist, you saw these incoherencies, maybe you dabbled in just being agnostic, that transitional phase, and then you were like, okay, I'm definitely a theist now. Like there's no other explanation. Or take us through that, and then how did you go from that to Christian?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it was that quick that I decided to become a theist. What I decided to do was reevaluate everything again. And in the same way that once I got to that sort of initial crisis with religion, I was open to considering other perspectives. I got to another crisis with atheism, interestingly enough. And so I decided I'm going to go back, like through the history of philosophers and thinkers and all the people that I just kind of dismissed. And I think I fell into the problem that I think a lot of people have today, is this sort of chronological condescension or snobbery, right? If somebody wasn't born 10 years ago and isn't doing the most up-to-date scientific research, then they probably didn't have anything important to say, or it's all been refuted, or it's all nonsense. I think to some degree I fell into that, where if like somebody was, I don't know, I was very arbitrary about what I would admit and wouldn't admit. But once I sort of broke down again, and had this sort of worldview crisis, I decided I'm just gonna go through different thinkers and just read as much as I can and weigh different perspectives. So I went back to the classic philosophers: Plato, Aristotle, Boethius, Augustine, and then of course Aquinas. Really slammed me against the wall. As is often the case, you get to this guy, and I wouldn't just say Aquinas, but the Thomistic tradition generally, because there's so many good contemporary theistic, Thomistic philosophers. And these guys just wailed on me. And I'm like, wow, these arguments are, like, at first I thought they were really interesting, and I didn't even know like certain arguments could be made for God's existence, starting from metaphysical principles like act and potency, or essence and existence, like principles, again, like the principle of sufficient reason that like cannot really be coherently denied. And then you just argue deductively to a conclusion. So it gives you a certain type of knowledge that you can be very certain of, as long as the argument is valid. And many of these arguments I did think were valid. And so I took a deep interest in natural theology and studying these traditional arguments for God's existence that do stretch back to many pagan philosophers. And you see in many different traditions, you see it in Islam and Judaism, even in Hinduism, right? Of thinkers who start from sort of basic metaphysical principles or facts of experience, and then reason deductively to some ultimate eternal cause of everything else that exists. And the more I studied this over the years, and the more I looked at the objections and then made even efforts of replication myself, I became absolutely convinced that there are a series of philosophical arguments that not only can demonstrate God's existence, but give you a very, very specific conception of God. Now, it's mostly negative of saying what God is not. God is not in time. God is not conditioned by space. God is eternal, omnipotent, omniscient. He's really an act of understanding itself. But what really kind of, the reason this is important anyways, is because if you're not just going from revelation, which I wasn't, reason in philosophy can really help to narrow the theological hunt, because you get to a God that is one and only one, and it's monotheism, right? And so this kind of like cuts away a great deal of religious options, and it really kind of narrows you down. If you do think that some religion might be true, it kind of narrows you down to the great monotheistic traditions, which would be Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and some forms of Hinduism. I would put in there as well. So polytheism is out, pantheism is out. And I always found that really, really interesting and useful, because, people always ask, well, how do you think, why do you think that your one religion over any other religion is true? And the answer is because I have good arguments for it. Right? Philosophical, historical, right? Just like the reason I hope I come to any other positions, political positions, right? Or positions on economics. I just think there's good arguments.
So you never say, I just have faith. It's like, no, I have good reasons. I have good arguments. Like, there's a reason for this.
And that's where Catholicism, and I haven't made the move to Catholicism yet, although it was certainly compatible with these philosophical arguments. So it's kind of interesting. When I was studying Aquinas, I said this in a recent interview, I really converted to being a Thomist before I was a Catholic. And I just admire the Thomistic tradition so much, but I kind of ignored a lot of his theological stuff because, I don't know, it wasn't that I wasn't interested. I was just kind of still in that deeply philosophical phase. But two things, that really stood out to me about Catholicism the whole time was that its tradition of affirming both faith and reason, that faith goes above reason. It's not below it, right? Reason can take you to a certain point. It can take you to monotheism. But faith super adds to that. It shows, monotheism is true, but God is also a trinity, right? 3 self-reflective acts of understanding sharing in one perfect divine substance. We can't get to that from reason alone. We do need revelation. But if I have good reason to believe that this revelation is reliable, then I have good reason to take the Trinity on faith. And it would be unreasonable for me not to take it on faith. So there's this deep compatibility between faith and reason. It's really just trusting what you already have good reason to believe, specifically in relation to authorities and persons and things like that. So it was not fideistic, which you would often see in the Protestant tradition, where it's just put reason aside, put science aside. And I couldn't do that. I'm a lover of science. I'm a lover of philosophy. So I needed to see that there was compatibility there. And Aquinas always affirmed this as well. He would say, look, faith and reason can never be at odds because they ultimately come from the same source. So if there's a conflict, either you're misunderstanding the deposit of faith or you're reasoning poorly. Either way, figure it out, dude. Like, there's opportunity here for greater understanding, but there can never be a true conflict. There can only be a superficial conflict. That was always attractive to me. Secondly, was the Catholic Church's bold affirmation of classical theism in particular. Not just that God exists, but God is really a lot of those things that I just described: eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, but also immutable, absolutely simple, which are conclusions of a lot of these arguments as well. Again, many of them are mysterious, difficult to really understand, but it always smacked me as like, wow, the Catholic Church is affirming this very boldly, which many divisions of Protestantism do not. So there was this correspondence and convergence, if you will, between where reason was leading me and what the Catholic Church was always kind of saying anyways. So that was in the background at this time. Yes.
And so you started honing in. Okay, you finally arrived at the conclusion, okay, there is one God, eternally existing. His essence is his existence, let's say. And so you arrived at this philosophical understanding. What kind of then pushed you to like, okay, I'm willing to now explore the great monotheistic religions? Did you ever dabble in Islam? Did you dabble in Judaism? Like, how did you arrive at Christianity? And then I know you dabbled a little bit in Protestantism, so I want to hear about that as well. But
I mean, I would say around this time I was convinced of theism, but I probably would have considered myself like a religious pluralist. And I was reading like books like Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy. I was like getting interested in religion proper again. And, the idea there is like all religions are true but false. Like, they're true in that they're pointing to something transcendent and important, but they're all false because they all ultimately get it wrong, right? And it's funny because that's religious pluralism is actually religious particularism when you think about it. It's all other religions are false except this one. We've got it right. Right. So it's kind of arbitrary. But ultimately, yeah, what got me out of that is I just think that the arguments for a particular religion, specifically Catholicism, are better than the arguments for religious pluralism. And yeah, I did look at the other religions, and the interesting thing about all these other religions that seemed compatible with where I was at philosophically is that they all make claims about Jesus. Every single one of them makes claims about Jesus, right? Catholic Church has claims about Jesus. Protestant denominations have claims about Jesus. Judaism has claims about Jesus. Islam has claims about Jesus. Hinduism has claims about Jesus. Even the non-monotheistic traditions have claims about Jesus. And the cool thing about that is you can test those claims historically. And you can go and you can look at Scripture, not just as the inspired word of God, which I think it is, but just as a collection of historical documents that came down out of the first century, and see what historians say about the reliability of these documents and what we can infer. So, I mean, just to give one example, Islam claims that Christ was never crucified. But that's about as far from the established facts of history as you can possibly get. Like, if there's anything that enjoys any close to a universal consensus among historians of antiquity, it's that Jesus not only existed but was crucified. Yeah. So it seems like Islam just has something that's fundamentally wrong about Jesus Christ, right? So in that sense, you can sort of narrow down the religious hunt through philosophy, but then you can whittle it away further by just applying scrutiny to the claims of Jesus and seeing who's got the best account to explain the data that we have. Yeah. And in that case, I came to believe that Christianity, this is what really had the best account, right? That Christ was who he claimed to be. He really did claim to be the eternal Son of God, that he was crucified, that he died, and that he was bodily resurrected from the dead, that God raised him from the dead. And since I already had prior belief philosophically of a God that is all good, all powerful, obviously miracles are possible then, right? Miracles are only impossible if you're an atheist. But it also just seemed like the sort of thing that an all good God would do, that he wouldn't be indifferent to our suffering, that he would want to reveal himself. And this is an important move, right? Philosophy can give you intelligible content about God, but it gives you in many ways the what of God, but it doesn't give you the who of God. It doesn't tell you about God's heart. Does this God love us? Does he, well, in one sense, philosophy can show that God is loving, but in a more intimate way, does he want to have a friendship with us? I think that's an even more important question. And I don't think philosophy can answer that. Aristotle famously said that we couldn't be friends with God. So it just seemed like the traditional Orthodox account of Christianity not only made best sense of the data between the facts that we know from the history of Christianity, the postmortem appearances, the empty tomb, the origin of the belief, the rapid spread of Christianity, people willing to die for these beliefs, the independent testimonies, the embarrassing details that are admitted, the undesigned coincidences, all these things. It seems like not only is the traditional Orthodox account the absolute best explanation of those facts, but in light of the prior beliefs and evidence I have of an all-good, loving God, it just fits like a hand in a glove. It just seems like, this is exactly the type of thing that an all-loving God would do, that he would enter into the depths of God-forsakenness to reclaim and redeem humanity for himself, to restore that eternal, loving, saving relationship with himself through this incredible act of self-sacrifice where he just bears all the humiliation and evil that we as humans inflicted upon him so that he could restore us and redeem us. That just seems like the type of thing an all good and all loving God would do. And that was it for me. So both philosophically and historically, that brought me to a general Christianity. But I'm sorry if you wanted to chime in there.
No, that was awesome. I felt like I just heard the gospel again. Like, it was just great. And so then you came to a general Christianity, and how did you explore that? Like, as far as exploring churches, and I guess you had to take into account the claims of Protestantism. And I know in our previous discussions we talked about sola scriptura and all those things. So how did it kind of, I know your stint in Protestantism was rather quick, but why was it quick? And like, what happened to kind of push you over the edge to the Catholic Church?
So the funny thing is at this time, even though I'm really moving, deeply into Christianity, is I still held a lot of baggage, emotional baggage from my years spent as a skeptic and an atheist. And part of that baggage was just a sort of emotional bias against Catholicism, right? When you're like heavily secularized and you're a naturalist, like nothing seems more athwart human prosperity than the Catholic Church. You know what I mean? So I was like anything but Catholic. And I began to grow in appreciation for the Catholic Church through its intellectual tradition, but there was still just this emotional resistance. And, it's important to understand that emotional resistance works in every direction. It works for theists. It's the same thing with atheists. Like we all experience a bias, emotional resistance. And I was definitely doing that. So my wife was going through her own conversion experience at the time. She was never baptized. She was not brought up in a religious home. And she said to me, okay, I'll explore Christianity with you, but no way in hell am I ever becoming Catholic. And she was confirmed just 2 years ago, by the way.
And now she has a podcast called The Catholic Mama. So that's perfect.
Yeah. So that's where she was. It just goes to show how deep her bias was. I mean, she was a very, secular, just, you can imagine the kind of caricature or archetype, not caricature, but archetype that she was, I guess, philosophically. But I was there myself. So, I was at this Mere Christianity, but I realized, like C.S. Lewis says in his book, like he admits, Mere Christianity is just a hallway. At some point you have to pick a door, because these different, Catholicism makes radically different claims than Protestantism, right? It claims to be the one true church that Christ founded. It claims that the sacraments are absolutely essential, and that there is no salvation outside of the church. Now, it doesn't mean that anybody who's in a Catholic won't be saved, that we have to heavily qualify that.
Right.
But it makes big claims. And I like big claims because Christ also made big claims. Right. So it actually kind of seems somewhat consistent, right? And big claims are good because you can kind of test them historically.
Yeah.
But I wanted to give Protestantism a shot because there were Protestant philosophers and theologians who impressed me. And I think I did try and do a very fair job of reading people from all different sides, because I just didn't want to be wrong again. Honestly, I just didn't want to be wrong. So I read, some really, and I still admire these people like Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig and Norman Geisler and there's so many great Protestant thinkers there are. And I have great respect for the tradition, but also just partly to nudge my wife around. She was willing to go to different churches, evangelical and Lutheran, just to kind of dip her toes in. So there was kind of mixed motives there for exploring Protestantism. But I think very quickly I discovered that there were sort of insurmountable difficulties with the Protestant paradigm. Sola Scriptura was one of them, right? No book can interpret itself. No book can teach you how to apply the consequences of that book in a modern day context. And Scripture can't even tell you what should count as Scripture or what should be in Scripture. And the thing for me is, like, if I'm going to be a Christian, like, I need this to go through all the way. I can't get to another arbitrary stopping point where I just throw my hands up and just say, I believe, right? That seems like that seems like hardly better than the brute fact that I was suffering with naturalism, right? Like, I just couldn't do it. Plus, when you look at the history of the church, you realize that not only were people, illiterate, most of them anyways, but the Bible as we have it didn't, like, Christ didn't ascend to heaven and say, don't forget to read my book, guys. That isn't what happened. He left us with a church. He gave that church his authority, the Holy Spirit, to guide it and protect it. It is really the foundation of truth. And it's through God guiding this church that we even got the Bible to begin with, right? That the church, through its sacred tradition, could reliably say, yes, this should be in canon and this shouldn't be in canon. So that solved a lot of the difficulty for me, and it also fit better with the historical evidence. And this was the other part of it. And that when I looked back at the apostolic and church fathers, when I read people like Clement, Ignatius, Irenaeus, up through Augustine and even beyond, but whether it's really early or even stretching, a little bit later, you just see the Catholic Church in its infancy. Surely, right? It's a baby at this time, but it's still essentially the same thing that it is now. And the big things that got me were the language of sacrifice and altars, and more than anything else, the undying devotion to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the sacramentality. I mean, yes, apostolic succession and the papacy too, but the Eucharist was so, I mean, overwhelmingly obvious that this was really the source and summit of the Christian life from the very beginning. And interestingly enough, that is something that the Catholic Church has always taught and continues to teach and defend even today, whereas most forms of Protestantism not only reject this, but they actively call it sacrilege and blasphemy.
Yeah.
And so there's this radical division here of like, look, either like something's got to give, right? Either the Catholics are right about this or they're deeply wrong, or vice versa. And it just seemed very obvious for me from going back, studying church history, going right back to the very beginning that, yeah, this is, I mean, and it's important, like it's in Scripture too. But if somebody reads the Scripture, you go through John 6, you go through the typology, and you still aren't entirely convinced, then you just add the additional context of, well, okay, well, what did the earliest Christians believe? And I think it just becomes overwhelming at that point that the sacramentality was there from the very beginning. And at that point, between the difficulties of sola scriptura, you know, epistemologically, and then studying church history of how the church worked, how it operated, that it was visible, hierarchical, unified, which was hugely important. The way that the early church fathers talked about schism was and should still be very alarming to anybody who goes back and talks about it.
Yeah.
Also, things like in Scripture, Matthew, you know, if there's a problem, take it before the church, and Jesus gives the grounds for excommunication. How you can explain that apart from a visible, unified, hierarchical church is just beyond me. So, like certain pieces of scriptural data just couldn't fit with Protestantism either. So I would say it was a cumulative case more than anything, which it often is. Pieces of converging and convincing arguments that all just kept pointing back to the Catholic Church. That eventually, I had to make the ascent. I need to become Catholic.
Wow. And when did you actually get confirmed, and how has your journey been since becoming Catholic? What are some of your favorite devotions and some of your favorite things that maybe kind of surprise you now that you're in the church? And yeah, so tell us a little bit about that.
Sure thing. I was confirmed 3 years ago. So, and it's kind of this funny thing. It's this gradual conversion, right? First, for me, it was the intellectual conversion. Then there was the emotional conversion, and then there's that ongoing spiritual conversion too. So I was like intellectually at the Catholic Church for a bit of time before I made some of the other moves. And it's funny because some other people I really admire their conversion story. It seems like that was the case for them as well. A good example, kind of an odd one, would be Mortimer J. Adler, who became a Thomist in his philosophical searching. So he's got a million different books out. They're all quite good and worth reading. But then he was like a pagan. First he was agnostic, then he became kind of a pagan Thomist, then he became a Protestant, and then he lived to like 98, I think. But then he got confirmed Catholic like 3 years before he died or something like that.
Wow.
So it's just interesting to see, that sort of thing happen. So I'm grateful that God brought me into the church before I'm 95 years old.
Yeah.
Very grateful for that, for the reasons that you've said, that I can partake in the sacraments and the devotions, and it's also beautiful. So I was confirmed in Philadelphia by under Archbishop Chaput, former Archbishop. I believe his resignation was just accepted actually by the Pope, but beautiful man. I mean, really just a beautiful man. And it was so incredible. It was so significant. And how has my life changed? Everything fundamentally about my life has changed. I mean, how hasn't my life changed would be,
wow.
I mean, everything from my entire family. I mean, we got our kids baptized, right? So that's a huge thing. My wife had her own conversion. I mean, I know we kind of come from somewhat different places, Eric, but you did convert as well to Catholicism. So I'm sure you went through a lot of these fundamental shifts yourself. I mean, just everything becomes completely reoriented. And it goes to show to me the truth of the inner sanctification that God does in our life when we cooperate with his grace, that he is here to turn us inside out in every possible way. Because look, frankly, I was living a life of deep sin in many ways. And there were many teachings of the church that seemed repellent to me at first, because it meant I have to change. I have to give these things up. I have to repent. And that's not easy for anybody to do. But I realized if I was going to be consistent, I needed to do that. So without getting into the gory details, I asked for God's help, and he gives you the grace, the sufficient grace to make those changes. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if this is a ambiguous answer. It's just that it's such an overwhelming
right
question.
No, it's so amazing. And so, Pat, this has been absolutely delightful and amazing. Like, I feel like I could take each of your sentences and be like, wait, let's hash that whole thing out. So we'll have to do probably some future episodes with all these things, but I'm so thankful you've come on and shared your story. Is there any last things you'd like to share about your story? And then lastly, where can people find you online and in your work? Tell us that.
Seek, right? I mean, that's where I was. And, one thing I think that's important to keep in mind as you're kind of thinking through these things, if anybody's kind of on the fence or agnostic, is keep Pascal's wager in the back of your mind. And people often misunderstand Pascal's wager. It's not an argument for God. It's something that kicks in once you reach a certain threshold of probability, right? So if you get to a point where you think maybe, 50-50 Christianity is true. Like if you get to that point, that's when you consider Pascal's wager and realize that it would be unreasonable not to seek it out spiritually. You don't have to fake belief. That's not what Pascal's wager is about. It's not about being inauthentic. It's engaging in authentic spiritual seeking. And that certainly was something that I can relate to, because I remember as I'm going through this process many times doing a lot of kind of like agnostic-y prayers. God, if there is a prayer, save my soul, I have a soul, that type of thing. Like, God, if you want me to be Catholic, help me, show me, lead me, like these types of things. And so I would just say, faith, even though it's above reason, as we talked about before, still is a gift. It's a grace. And we should ask God for, and there's no hurt in asking and seeking. And I believe that God will answer that prayer if you sincerely ask it. So I guess that's just the final remarks about that. And where can you find me? A couple different places. My podcast is The Pat Flynn Show. Your listeners might be interested in two segments. I have Philosophy Friday, the somewhat occasional Philosophy Friday. I'm a little bit behind on that. And that's where we just explore different philosophical topics. And then I have a much more consistent Sunday School, and that's where we talk about usually anything in the realm of Catholicism. Everything else could be anything from fitness to business or music or whatever happens to be on the docket. And then my website is chroniclesofstrength.com. And if you're into like weight training and kettlebells and stuff, then you'll probably find some stuff that you like over there.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Pat. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, my friend.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.